Good afternoon.
Доброго дня. Будемо переходити до останньої сесії сьогодні. Дякую за те, що з нами. По-перше, з нами
On my left, the senior strategist, cyber lead of the Ukrainian election task force, a senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at Atlantic Council. Thanks for joining us. On our right is Dr. Kenneth Geers, cyber analyst also with the Ukrainian election task force and a senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security with the Atlantic Council. Afternoon, Kenneth. Yuliya Shypilova. Yuliya, good afternoon. Yuliya is a senior electoral advisor for Ukraine with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And Dr. Alina Polyakova, on my right, is the David Rubenstein Fellow of the Foreign Policy Center at the Brookings Institution. So thank you all for joining us. The subject of the panel is cyber interference in the election cycle. I think the first comment I would make to begin with would be that whilst there were no let's say, headline cyber interference incidents, no major catastrophes or crises, there were actually a wide range of cyber incidents and evidence of cyber meddling, all of which could have significant implications going forward, both for Ukraine and for the wider world. We've seen repeatedly that strategies employed by the Kremlin have afterwards have been developed in Ukraine and then afterwards have been redeployed or repackaged and used in other theaters in America, in Europe and elsewhere. That's quite a strong pattern, so it adds extra impetus on the need to analyze what's going on in Ukraine, to be aware of the broader implications on a global scale. But to begin with, I would like, Laura, if I may begin with you, I would like to invite you to discuss how you see the Ukraine's cyber infrastructure, the democratic infrastructure, and specifically the Central Election Commission, how they stood up to the challenges of the campaign. We know from their comments that there were incidents of cyber attacks, but the election was managed fairly well. Can we talk about a success story from their point of view?
Yes, it's a... How do I turn this down?
I'm not sure, please.
Okay, great. We'll switch. Well, I think that's a good opening. So how did Ukraine fare, particularly with an eye on the CEC, during the 2019 elections? And if you have to look at it overall, I think that you see a Ukraine in 2019 that is vastly more prepared in terms of cybersecurity in both the government sector and in awareness by the public. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is investment. So since the 2014 headline attack on the CEC, where the actual reporting of the winner of 2014 was attacked, thwarted, and changed on the CEC's website, it was certainly a red flag that Ukraine needed to invest in cybersecurity, and more broadly that elections were a target. And remember, this is before 2016. This is a very early period looking at the cybersecurity vulnerabilities around elections. And what we saw were these steps around investment that were both Ukrainian, to get Ukrainian government systems, and that wasn't just the CEC, that was the SSS CIP, it was the SBU, it was other government agencies taking serious steps to look at their own networks and be able to understand what a damaging attack looks like, what a baseline looks like, and how you portray that and mitigate that sort of risk that they would be under attack on a regular basis. The other piece is awareness. So since 2014, there have been, in my mind, 3 catastrophic and major cyber attacks in Ukraine that have probably not gotten enough attention worldwide. The first 2 were in the category of critical infrastructure, where Black Energy is the group and malware and attack used in late 15, in December 15, and then again in 2016 to take down parts of the power grid. And those attacks really constituted the first time where we saw a direct kinetic action linked to a cyber attack and it was in the critical infrastructure sphere. And this is what gave us a real precursor, not just in Ukraine, to the level of devastation that a cyber attack could have and the Russians' willingness to do it. This was attributed again to the same group in the GRU. The third incident is not Petya. In 2017, the most expensive and costly cyber attack that has happened worldwide took down numerous multinational companies in Ukraine. We can speak more to the implications of that. But it was those three precursors coupled with the 2014 CEC attack that gave Ukraine and the West an impetus to fund investments in cybersecurity and laid the groundwork for, I think, a fairly positive story in 2019. So I'll stop there as sort of the overlay of how we see the election.
Thank you. Is that microphone working? It's not working, no? Is this one? Okay, this is, sorry, excuse me. Talking about the human factor in the cybersecurity issue, Yuliya, I'd like to, one of the things that was quite interesting about the various incidents, the various specific incidents in the run-up to the election, was the targeting of actual employees at the Central Election Commission. Now, we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about digital technology, but actually at the end of the day, it's people. And specifically, there were attempts to block them having access to the network in I think it was in February, and prior to that in January there were phishing attacks, attempts to get their data and to infiltrate the system. In your interaction with people from the CEC, how aware are they of this? Is the training going on? Are they being made to be aware that they are actually key elements in this cybersecurity system as well as the technical aspect?
Thank you for this question. So first of all, we should keep in mind that nowadays almost 2/3 of EMBs, electoral management bodies, are facing with different types of cyber attacks. And also we should keep in mind that 90% of cyber attacks happen due to human factors. So due to the fact that people do not pay attention to cyber hygiene, they are opening some questionable emails, they are following questionable links and so on. And I believe that comparatively to 2014 presidential election, the Central Election Commission is doing much better comparatively to what happened previously, and mostly due to the fact that they received trainings on cyber hygiene. So for the first time, such trainings were conducted in Ukraine for almost 800 of election officials, almost 300 at the central level and some 400-500 at the lower level. But at the same time, we should keep in mind that time frame for the appointing of lower level commissions, which are dealing separately with the CEC infrastructure at regions, is quite complicated. They are appointed just close to election, and it's quite complicated to conduct really good training for them. They are quite busy with other stuff. They need to organize elections, and it would be even more difficult during parliamentary elections since they will be running in single-member constituencies, and they will be even more busy with organizational part. So this time, the CEC staff received training on cyber hygiene and especially on phishing emails, and they've paid much more attention to this issue, and they understand the importance of these issues. Now they are able to check the links which they receive, they are able to check the emails address which they receive and find whether such email is real or whether it is an attempt to get information. But also we should keep in mind that even attempt to get such information shows a great interest to this information. And even if now these attempts were not such successful, it doesn't mean that further this information won't be used. So we're all aware that during presidential campaign, especially Russian Federation and so on, countries which are interested on influences elections, they were mostly testing rather than really influencing the elections. They were getting information, they were trying to find vulnerabilities and gaps, and maybe they also left some gaps which they could also use further. So this time they just gathered lots of information, and it could be quite risky for further development.
presumably with an eye to the parliamentary elections.
Yes.
Yes, I see. Kenneth, we're talking about the centre of the infrastructure, as it were, the Central Election Commission. What about on a nationwide scale? Where do you see, having monitored the campaign, where do you see the chinks in the armour, the weaknesses where the system is vulnerable to this sort of attack? And not only in terms of the voting in the regions, but maybe also other aspects of cyber infrastructure.
So one of the things about a cyber attack that makes defense so hard is that tactically they're very hard to stop, right? Professional hackers are very good at what they do, and the CEC is a good example here. So there was phishing against the employees, an attempted purchase of their personal credentials on the dark web, denial of service against the CEC from a botnet, right? So it's hard to defend against all this because a cyber attack is sort of a Swiss Army knife. You know, you can pull out one element or close it and pull out the screwdriver part. That didn't work. Let me try the knife, you know. So it's a real challenge. That said, there are many, I think, tactical, and Russia seems to specialize in this as well, tactical cyber victories that may be strategic losses, right? In other words, they're ephemeral, or they only last for a period of time. And I like Katrina this morning mentioned, she said, well, you can't just come monitor an election. It's a whole of life thing, and you have to keep at it. And I think that's the real challenge, but also where I see Ukraine really succeeding as well. To me, it seems like Ukraine is very sure about where it wants to go strategically, right? And therein will lie the success story, right? I mean, think about what happened in the United States in 2016. We were so shocked by this cyber attack. Right? It's like we didn't realize, we should have seen it coming, really, because in Ukraine, you had a cyber attack against your election in 2014. And the United States should have seen that as a warning, right? That there's one internet, one cyberspace, and all the countries are in it trying to defend their portion and their sovereignty. And I know I've been a cyber analyst for a long time. So I sat in the basement of the Pentagon almost 20 years ago, looking at long lists of IP addresses. We look this one up, it's in Nigeria. Look that one up, it's in Kenya. Another one in China, and Virginia, Wisconsin, Maryland. And you get lost in it. And one of the really important things to know about cyber attacks is that they will come from maybe a different vector or country every time. And the best way, even tactically, to address them is through international partnerships, right? And that's why really the best place to look for strength and the future of cybersecurity is within alliances. And there's nothing on the planet like the EU and NATO, right? So this is where political and military collaboration will take place and has. There's nothing like the European Convention on Cybercrime. There's nothing like NATO saying we're going to protect cyberspace as we did air, land, and sea for the past 7 decades. So I think that Ukraine is in a great place, and I admire sort of the youth and energy and focus, because I don't think we have it nearly enough in the United States of where we want to be, how to use our resources, right? And for me, I think this is a great part of the world to see that.
Thank you. To continue on that theme, Ukraine as an inspiration, perhaps if we can put it that way. Alina, just between the first and second rounds, Facebook official David Agranovich actually came out and said Russia is testing election interference, that these methods will be tested here and will be used internationally to undermine political trust. This is a common theme in the broader context of hybrid warfare, that Ukraine is a place where Russia tests its technologies and techniques. What can we take from the recent campaign? What are the lessons for the wider world? You know, what are the alarm bells that should be going off now in Brussels, in Washington, and throughout the international community?
Yes, so thanks very much, Peter, for that question, and just thank you for the Atlantic Council and all the organizers of this interesting conversation we're having today. You know, I think it's unfortunate in some ways that Ukraine has been a first in so many ways, as Laura said. You know, it's the first place to have an attack on the election infrastructure system in 2014, as Laura said, the first to have an attack on the physical infrastructure system, the electrical grids, and I think exactly for the reasons that we've been talking about, we haven't been paying attention to this, and we should have been, obviously, in the West for all the reasons that Kenneth just mentioned. But I think one thing we have learned, I hope we have learned, is that what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. It comes to us eventually. And that this is not just about elections. I mean, the NotPetya attack had nothing to do with the elections, right? Most cyber attacks don't happen around the time of elections. That certainly provides a large threat space. So there's more space to play, everyone's focusing, so there's more opportunities. But certainly these tools and techniques are being tested continuously over time. And just to point out a few things about how things from Ukraine have come to the United States specifically, I mean, obviously in the social media disinformation campaign space, but we already spent a lot of time talking about that. That's number one. Everything that we saw happening in the information space in the United States around 2016, and that we continue to see today, happened in Ukraine first. And it happened a long time ago in Ukraine. But number two, when it comes to critical infrastructure attacks, there was a 2018 report from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security in the United States that identified the exact same malware, this black energy malware, on some of the electrical, nuclear, and waterway grids in the United States. And we know they're just sitting there as a sort of ticking time bomb that could be set off whenever, but it's there. The third piece I would point out is that we just recently had the publication, or redacted publication, of the Special Counsel investigation to Russian interference in the U.S. elections. And one of the things that came out from that's gotten some attention, though not nearly enough, is the fact that there were 21 states in which that investigation identified a breach of the voting systems. And one of them was Florida, which we didn't know about before. We knew about some of those cases, especially in districts where they're very decisive for U.S. elections, right? So this was a very strategic, focused penetration of very specific areas that could swing an election that's very close, which is what we're talking about before. That was not the case in Ukraine. But if we had a situation here where the election was very close, I would have expected to see much more of this much targeted kind of interference. So I think some of the lessons learned to take away from that, as we see more and more of similar tactics and techniques in the cyberspace and disinformation space coming to the West. I could go on a long list of some similar breaches you've seen in Germany, for example, in their parliamentary cyber networks, et cetera. But I think the lesson learned should be that we need to have kind of a document at some point, hopefully, that is shared by the Ukrainian Central Election Committee, the Ukrainian cybersecurity services, of how they were successful in preventing the many attacks they encountered. Because we don't hear about the prevented cases. We hear about the big disasters, right? We hear about the votes being changed. We hear about NotPetya affecting companies across the world. But we need to start focusing on prevention much more. And I think in the cyberspace, a good defense is probably the best offense. That's not true everywhere, but certainly I think it's true in the cyber domain. So what I would like to see, going forward is much more information sharing through some of the channels that Ken mentioned. Even though Ukraine is not a NATO member state, is not EU member state. But again, I would like to see more participation from the Ukrainian government, especially some of the Ukrainian IT and cybersecurity firms involved here, in really translating, what specific steps did the Ukrainian governments take to be able to prevent some of the attacks that they were experiencing that we've been talking about.
Thank you. So if we can look forward now, and if I again invite you to speculate a little bit about what we can expect to see in the coming months leading up to the October elections. The parliamentary campaign is is a very different proposition to the presidential campaign. Could it be, Yuliya, if I could begin with you, could it be, do you think, you mentioned that there may be breaches or positions that were established that are lying dormant, that haven't been used yet. Could it be perhaps that because Russia really didn't have a chance of getting a win in the presidential elections, they didn't push some of these options, whereas in the parliamentary election, of course, Russia will be hoping to make gains with the opposition bloc, with the Zajitya party, perhaps with other candidates. They'll be looking to gain more of a foothold in parliament, and they'll be actually trying to play a promotional role rather than necessarily simply spreading chaos and a negative position in the elections. Do you think that this will set the stage for a much more active role from Russia?
Yeah, I believe that first of all, parliamentary elections are much more attractive for Russia and for any other country which want to influence the Ukrainian elections, since the constituency size is much smaller comparatively to presidential election where we have nationwide constituency, and of course it is much easier to influence the outcome of the elections in the smaller constituency when the value of vote is much lower, and in order to win the run, it's not such difficult to get more votes. However, we should remember and we should keep in mind that fortunately for Ukraine, it still counts votes based on paper ballots. So even if IT system would be damaged by any chance, Ukraine will still establish the official results based on paper-based ballots. So this is the great guarantee for Ukraine that elections won't be damaged. And the only one thing which is truly risky is the impression that something was harmed. And sometimes this impression of hacking of such system is even more dangerous and more important than the actual damage, since it's quite difficult for the CEC or for the District Election Commission to convince people that ballots were counted fairly. It's quite difficult to convince people on this, since one shared information that the system was damaged, and for people who are not such aware of what is happening and how ballots are actually counted, it's quite difficult to believe that nothing happened. And even during presidential campaign, lots of people in media were using term electronic protocol. Ukraine doesn't have electronic protocol. So, and lots of media, if you would watch TV channels and their TV shows, they were all using this term electronic protocol. So it's only the provisional data which were entered in at the District Election Commission level, and it's just informational result. It's not official result. And that's why the CEC was waiting for such a long for these protocols with stamps, and based on these protocols they've actually established results. But for the CEC it's a great challenge to explain this process to people so that people are aware that even any influence on the IT infrastructure is not such harmful. So it's just harm to the system, but it's not harm to the outcome of the elections.
Laura, the issue of public confidence in the electoral system and concerns about falsification, etc., is very, very current and very relevant. It remains in Ukraine. Although we've just had what, by all accounts, was an extremely democratic and open and fair vote. Nevertheless, before the vote, there was an almost non-stop torrent of speculation, allegations, and innuendo that there would be mass falsification. It didn't happen, but still, this seems to be a perception that is widespread. Perhaps it's a cynical public opinion, perhaps, but. Do you think that the authorities and the election commission and the state in general could be and should be doing more to inform the public about the mechanics of the voting system, to create greater confidence, to launch perhaps an information offensive to show people how the democratic system is working, the nuts and bolts?
Well, I think I might take a slight issue with the characterization of a lack of legitimacy around the results right now, because at least from what I've seen, especially with the margin that Zelensky just won this second round with, I think people feel very convinced that this was an election that represented a strong process and a vote that was clear, and a lack of interference, right? So I think that we come out of this presidential with a bit of a precedent here in building a strong democratic process around voting. So I don't know how much of a role the CEC and Ukrainian officials need to have in driving a public awareness campaign around this. I think that the question to me is, are we seeing Moscow's and the Kremlin's decision calculus changing on how they will use cyber means to interfere in the sovereign activities of states, not just elections? And I think if there's one intermediary lesson here, particularly out of 2016, and as we've seen now in this election in 19, it's that the egg on the face of the Kremlin, the sort of backlash of what has been years now of finger pointing, and rightfully so, at Russian interference in elections, has made Moscow wary to use this tool set. Now, that does not stand for disinformation, as we have seen in the long, nuanced war that has been playing out in the information space, right? And I think that does run slightly counter to the thesis that many people had for years, which is that technical cyber measures, hacking networks, attacks, et cetera, would be used as a precursor to further activity, right? And I think what we've now seen is
І ми тепер бачимо, що
ease of attribution at this point, and I use ease in a sort of set of quotations here because it's not easy to attribute, but because attribution has been happening with these cyber attacks, and because the Kremlin has very much been seen as the bad guy across the world on this, they do not have the same sense of impunity around waging cyber attacks that was the case just a few years ago. And I think that's an important factor even going into these parliamentary elections, which do provide a level of obscurity because they are not as centralized, because of a lot of what Yuliya laid out. It does provide more obscurity for the Kremlin to use its hand. But I think that broader risk calculus still stands, that it's going to be very difficult for Moscow to interfere in a similar manner to what we've seen previously because of the blowback.
Sorry, Ken, you'd like to add something?
I wanted to add something.
Yes, please do. Please go ahead.
Just to follow up on this point that Laura just made about backlash and how that's changing the strategy from the side of the Kremlin, because attribution has become more common, or we're more comfortable with it, I should say, in this particular space. I mean, one data point is that during the U.S. midterm elections just this past fall, information was reported that the U.S. intelligence agencies sent messages to specific Russian individuals who were named in the special counsel indictments to basically say, we know who you are, and if you try to screw with us, we will come for you. And I think that has been a real deterrent, although we don't know for sure because it's all happening at the intelligence level. Ken, I don't know what you think about that, but it seems to me that we can attribute some of the lack of these kinds of attacks, despite the threat space being quite large. I mean, the black energy already sitting on our grids, some of the penetrations of the voting systems in multiple U.S. states, but we didn't see this kind of activity. I think because that message was clearly sent, we know what you're doing and don't do it again. But I will say one other thing. I think that I'm not so sure, I'm not so confident, although Laura is much more an expert on this than I am, regarding the change in Kremlin strategy becoming a bit more cautious. mainly because they are very able to obscure, obfuscate, and hide these activities. And we've certainly seen this in the information space, where they have evolved and worked around and adapted to some of our responses, particularly in the social media takedowns. We had this long conversation this morning about that. It's become much more difficult to detect because they're adapting their tactics and techniques, even though the objectives are staying the same. And I think that's probably true in the cyberspace. We know that the Russian government works closely with criminal hacker groups, and they give them refuge on Russian territory. And the price to usually pay for that is when, the FSB or anybody else comes knocking on your door to do a little deal, to do a little project. You kind of have to do it, right? Because the consequences will be you get put in Russian jail. Nobody wants to go there. So I think they will increasingly, and we're already seeing them doing this in all their influence operations, moving to this proxy war type of attack, making attribution so much more difficult. The threat vectors I'm most worried about, in a way, is not this direct GRU attack that can be attributed in the way that Laura has described, but what we saw happening with WannaCry, which was attributed to the North Koreans, actually. But what that threat vector was there was a exposure of NSA tools that were leaked. And then this group called the Shadow Brokers put it all over the internet. And then that got picked up by a hacking group in North Korea and used to attack various data systems and infrastructures. And those are the kinds of threat vectors I see where where's the attribution there? Who are the shadow brokers? The tools are American tools, right? Yes, the attribution at the end of the day goes to North Korea, but that entire loop, I think, is going to become increasingly more and more sophisticated and much more difficult for us to penetrate.
Well, I think the complexity of cyberspace is clear, right? That non-state actors, multiple agencies, even, there's a famous story of the CIA had set up this jihadist website, and then the NSA takes it down, right? So I'm sure that in Russia and elsewhere, similar, things are happening. But think about it, it's absolutely true. The complexity of the space is what allows hackers to pick and choose targets. And when I said earlier about the EU and NATO offering so much, it's not necessarily because they're so smart on hacking. It's that they are a collection of about 30, law enforcement, intelligence, and network security bodies that work together. But if you think about it, they're going to be as excited about working with Ukraine as vice versa. I mean, think about the expertise here and the language and history and ability to understand Russia as well.
Just to intercede there, I was just going to say, are they as excited in your experience? I mean, are they as aware?
Well, they were here for the 2019 election, so there were, well over 100, I think, experts from the EU and NATO here. They're going to be thrilled to work with Ukraine, right, and Ukrainians, and we need it, frankly, right? The number of real experts on Russia in the United States is not large. We're not great at foreign languages or international relations either, generally speaking. So we need their expertise. Churchill famously said, Russia is a puzzle and mystery and an enigma, that sort of thing. I think that may or may not be fully true, but that's at least the perception. Ukrainians know Russia, though, right? They know the language, they know the history very well. And so just think about all that the Ukraine has to share with the EU and NATO. It's going to be extraordinary.
Alina, you've already spoken about the crossover or the expansion of Ukrainian of techniques developed in Ukraine to be used in the wider world. How do you see the techniques that you've been witnessing in the presidential election being implanted into the parliamentary campaign? Do you see any big differences there in terms of strategies that you expect to see?
Well, I think, as my colleagues already said, it is a more complex threat space. or opportunity to manipulate. I think for that reason, there's both opportunity and difficulty there from the adversarial perspective, right? I think one reason, for example, why in the United States we didn't see a great deal of interference in addition to some deterrent strategies that the United States government pursued was because the U.S. congressional elections are really complicated, right? And it's a huge territory, and what's your objective, right? I mean, you have to do a lot more research than what the IRA did in 2016, where we just had a general election with 2 candidates, and I think it was pretty obvious what the preferred choice was there from the Russian perspective. So I think, one thing that I would be concerned about is actually we haven't talked about this yet, is the EU parliamentary elections in May, which are coming up very soon. I think we have time between now and October, assuming that's when the Ukrainian parliamentary elections would be, for the Ukrainians to prepare. I think this election, because of all the focus on it from social media companies, from various governments, is a really important sort of pivot point to understand for Ukrainians what they might experience in 6 months. But like Ken, I'm much more optimistic about Ukrainians' ability to deter future attacks of any kind than I am about the European Union, for example, which to my mind, I don't think is very well prepared, whether they be in the information space, they're trying, but it's been a very slow process, or whether they be in the cyberspace. And I think from the Russian perspective, there's a lot to be gained from the EU parliamentary elections, meaning there's an opportunity there to really push forward in various ways, and there may not be a hard cybersecurity component there, just by supporting and through information resources, financial resources, some of these pro-Russian far-right political groups that stand to gain a great deal in these elections. And from the Russian perspective, this is an ample opportunity to try to manipulate those results.
Yuliya, sorry, would you like to?
Yeah, if I may add here, it's like when someone starts to say that Ukraine is a playground for Russia to test its further cyber attacks, I would say that each next country is a playground for Russia to test their strategies. So with each country, they try to test what will work and what will want. And also they are trying to see what will be the resilience, what will be the behavior of authorities. And in this regard, for Ukraine, it is important to pay attention to their neighbors and what happened in neighborhood countries. For example, in recent parliamentary elections in Moldova, it was quite interesting case when hackers and we don't know exactly, but more likely this hacking attack came from Russia as well. 2 weeks ahead of elections, they've tried to hack the CEC IT system in Moldova. And after this, in 2 weeks, during E-Day, they've intensified their attacks. And so 2 weeks ahead of elections, they've tested what they could do, and during the E-Day, they've just intensified their actions. But also what was even more dangerous is like this attack, they used 2 types of attacks. They used DDoS attack, which was masking attack, in order to mask another type of attack. So once the authorities started to counteract DDoS attack, which was quite massive, at the same time they used different types of other attacks in order to distrust system. And it was even more complicated to counteract since everyone was focused on counteracting DDoS attacks. In terms of Ukraine, we should also keep in mind that maybe such attacks won't be focused on all single-member constituencies. For example, it may not happen on the east of Ukraine, on the west of Ukraine, but it is more likely to happen in Odessa, in Nikolaev, in Kharkiv, in Donetsk and Lugansk region, where Russia could have much more interesting result comparatively to what they could achieve at the west of Ukraine.
I can add one more. So I think that sometimes questions around cybersecurity feel like they're in a vacuum, away from the rest of the political situation and military situation that's happening. And I think that's a real risk, right? And I would caution us to make sure that we look at the broader strategic goals that the Kremlin will have out of this election, but even after the Rada, right, elections. And I think Ambassador Herbst put it very well when he touched just for a minute on how important destabilizing Ukraine as an economic player is within Putin's personal and governmental interest, right? I thought it was an incredible statistic that 33 to 50% of port income in port revenue is now down in Mariupol and Andyansk. And I think here's the parallel that I am worried about that happens in cyberspace. You look at NotPetya, the 2017 costly attack that took down multinationals in Ukraine. And that has spurred the largest cyber insurance case of all time. Billions of dollars are at stake because of this. Huge insurance companies insured the multinationals in Ukraine who were working there, and there was an exclusion in their insurance policy for acts of warfare. Well, what happened in NotPetya? These were GRU hackers who went in and took down systems at major pharmaceutical companies and other multinationals and took operations offline for days. Now, the question is that an act of warfare that would allow the insurance companies to not pay enormous amounts of damages? This is the first act of cyber warfare arbitration that we're doing, and it's in insurance court, and it happened in Ukraine. If this is now 2 years going in litigation, but if we see the end of that arbitration or court judgment, which will happen in the U.S., say to companies, it's risky to do operations in Ukraine because it's a war zone. Well, that's an enormous win on the side of the Kremlin, right? To be able to destabilize Western investment in operations here. And that's from a cyber attack, right? So I think it's really important to look at elections, to look at vulnerabilities there. But let's not forget how much cyber attacks in this space parallels or allows for other goals to be achieved at a strategic level and not be too certain that if we just secure elections, we'll feel good about the broader security of Ukraine's future.
Kenneth, I wanted to come back. It was very interesting your comments about 20 years ago being in the situation rooms, studying this, delving into these issues of cybersecurity going back 2 decades. But to a degree, it still feels like we're just getting started in this field. The whole sphere, almost like the start of aviation at the start of 20th century or something. We've had the great cyber revolution, and now we're having the great cyber warfare revolution. Where are we in terms of our evolution of understanding of this issue? And what can Ukraine do to contribute to this? Globally, I'm talking here.
So that's a great question. We are now asking computers to ask the questions, right? And so this is where we are in terms of science. And we hardly have time to catch our breath, I think, right? If you think about the difference between, Estonia in 2007 was extremely simple compared to what happened in Ukraine in 2014. That's the march of IT and the march of IT attacks, right? But they've gone from, fairly simple to very complicated. But now in terms of computer science, really, now computers talk to computers way more than humans talk to humans. And now we're asking the computers to ask questions that we don't even understand. And 5G is a good example. So the next generation of telecommunications, basically, computers are going to be talking to each other all the time, right? Decentralized. So it's going to be a little bit crazy. Some of the research that I do, though, I think has been helpful in that for the past 2.5 years, I've had access actually to about 4 to 5 million rows of malware detections every day from every country on the planet. including North Korea. And I could show you some of the most interesting things. I've looked at it in politics and military, business deals, that sort of thing. And I can tell you that anything that's in the newspapers, anything geopolitical, is a magnet for malware, right? So I saw it, for example, I'll give you one thing. This piece made it into the Washington Post just before our election. And about 6 months before the election in the United States, the midterms, every state had about what you thought it would in terms of malware detection. But about 2 weeks before the election, the 13 swing states had a higher volume of malware than did the 37 non-swing states, right? So, and I saw it all around the world, in Russia, in Turkey, in Africa, in South America. And it's a range of things probably, but you can be sure, though, that that anything like an election is going to bring a wide range of malware. And I think Alina's right in that really cyber defense is the best offense in this case, because there's so many players in this field, and agencies and contractors and hacktivists and things. Honestly, you don't know, you don't have time to figure out who it is. And here's the other thing. If you figure out who it is attacking you, what are you going to do about it? Right? There's no answer in so many cases to either one of those questions. So it's tough. We've moved in the 80s and 90s of not knowing who is attacking us. Right now, what we call attribution is much better. And the United States has named not only countries, but individuals in Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran, right? On the FBI, you'll see their names and faces. And that's serious. I do think there's some real deterrence going on there. Now they can't travel abroad. But it's still hard to know if you're stopping the hacker threat or lowering the cyber threat. That's, I guess, still up for debate.
What about the human factor in the broader population? We saw some examples in the recent Ukrainian election of attempts and as far as I understand, incidents of people renting out their social media, for example. Every system has people controlling it, inputting it. Obviously, there's going to be malicious individuals and there's going to be people who are corrupted, but is there a case for a defense through informing people more about the way these things work and the damage that can be done by what they may consider to be fairly innocuous engagement with people? For example, saying, okay, you can use my Twitter account for a month and pay me a rent or something like that. I mean, how much do we need to actually look to be informing the Ukrainian public and for that matter, the wider public, the international European audiences, for example? Alina, do you have any?
Sure. I think this specific example is fascinating. This report on individuals being approached to, rent out their Facebook accounts. But I think what's fascinating about this to me is that it's market forces at play. Because it's like the new gig economy in some ways. And the fact is, people are realizing that their personal data online is worth a lot of money. And they want to benefit from it too, right? Right now, it's just the social media companies that are benefiting from being able to sell ads that are then targeted at us as individual users because of the data we share, the personal data we share with the social media platforms and other I would say websites and sellers of products, et cetera. But I thought this was really smart from the point of view of an individual who's trying to make a little money on the side, and also from the point of view of a potential adversary that's trying to use these accounts they don't have to set up and spend a lot of time. It takes a very long time to set up an account that looks like a real account, especially on Facebook, that has a history, that has interactions, that has friends. Think about how much time people spend on their Facebook accounts until they look real, right? And I think what was discussed earlier in the disinformation panel about how there's sort of the shift in the strategy, or I should say the tactics, to move more and more towards these closed group networks, right? Instead of pushing out content, just kind of like throwing spaghetti at the walls. It's really about infiltrating specific groups and then trying to manipulate discussion within those groups in certain ways. And this we saw happening on Twitter as well. There's been a lot of interesting research that when Twitter released the IRA data set a few months ago, last fall, a researcher at the University of Washington who was looking, just at political polarization, she wasn't interested in manipulation, recognized some of the accounts that Twitter had attributed to the IRA. And when she mapped those accounts onto her research, what she found is that these Russian accounts were actually driving the core of the conversation in these polarizing groups on Twitter. So it was like the Black Lives Matter groups, the Blacktivist groups, quote unquote, and the white nationalist groups, right? And they were driving these groups apart very strategically. So I think, one, we're seeing these kinds of tactics. We should inform the general public. We should also inform policymakers. I think social media companies still don't know what to look for, honestly, in some ways. They've done a great job, taking down automated accounts, for example. That's pretty easy to do. You don't need human review. You can do that with an algorithm, right? Take down, I think Twitter has taken down something like 300 million accounts or something, if I'm not mistaken, automated accounts. I have to double check that. Was it millions? Certainly in the millions. So I think going forward, there's a generational component here. What we're talking about right now are really short and mid-term threats. They're threats to specific electoral cycles. They're threats to specific events that we can track, right? The kind of these bell curves that Ken is describing around elections across the world. And what you're asking is this much longer question of resilience, right? How do we actually start to build in some kind of fail-safes or stopgaps so that the demand for either false information, sensational information, or a lack of awareness about, well, you might make an extra $20 a month selling your Facebook account, but is that really a good idea, right? So thinking through some of these things, and I am seeing a lot of progress in that space, actually. I'm actually very optimistic about this. I'm less optimistic about our ability to deter cyber attacks, frankly, but much more optimistic about our ability over time to build the kind of critical lens that most Ukrainians have, frankly. When I give versions of this talk in the United States and Western Europe, what I always say is, you give any Ukrainian, I would almost bet on this, 2 pieces of content about the same event, and one is a Russian propaganda content, one is not. I think they'll be able to say, oh, that's just Russian propaganda, right? Because people have, from years and years of being under this information attack, I think people have a lens here in a way that Americans don't have, in a way that a lot of Western Europeans don't have. And so the question is, again, Ukraine is a first because it's been under attack for so long. How do we start to translate some of these lessons learned into our own societies in Western democracies? And there are some interesting things happening there. I don't want to go into too much detail because it's much, like we have a whole different panel on education and resilience and all of that. But that is just to say that, we can be very effective at the short term, medium term, but we need to have a much longer view if we actually want to make it a much more sustainable kind of resistance and resilience strategy going forward.
Laura, following on from that point, there is a sense in Ukraine that there is a widespread recognition that the country is engaged in a hybrid war. It is engaged in a hybrid conflict with Russia. That is seen as the source of the cyber threats to the country, and that helps people to mobilize resources as best they can, and have done in recent years. Is that awareness lacking in America, in your experience, in what you're seeing in Europe, in terms of the recognition that there is an adversary who is a hostile force that is looking to attack wherever they see opportunities to do so? And how damaging is that in terms of responses?
Well, having a hot war, a few hundred miles away from the capital focuses the mind, right? No doubt about it. And now almost more than 5 years running, I think that the awareness that Russia will use a variety of techniques to couple its kinetic actions to make them more effective, and that includes in cyberspace and that includes in the information space, is well known here. And I think, Alina, you put that example of just about any Ukrainian can tell you what's a piece of Russian propaganda and what's not if you put 2 samples in front of them. What I am worried about in terms of the U.S. takeaway from this, which you're getting at, is we don't have, and hopefully we won't have, any sort of hot war in the U.S., right? And without that very visible and deadly signal, will there be enough of a wake-up call has there been enough of a wake-up call in the US to realize what domestic and sometimes foreign forces are at play to change your mind, right? And I think if there's one huge lesson from that first very good panel this morning, it was in short that the Russian interference playbook has been swallowed in whole domestically by a lot of different actors here in Ukraine, right? And the Russians certainly weren't the first to, use a variety of information techniques and technical cybersecurity techniques to kind of compromise your mind and change how people thought, but they sure got good at it quickly, right? And I think in the US, we're dealing with kind of 3 years of discussion around what happened in 2016, but I'm not sure that discussion has translated into people seeing that their media environment and how they get their news and how they perceive the world is being manipulated and being driven by forces that they aren't used to evaluating, right? In a lot of ways, I'm saying the same thing as Alina, which is we don't have the same instincts built, which took 60 years in Ukraine, right? We don't have those same instincts to kind of sniff out what feels fake or what feels like you need to dig deeper, and those basic kind of questions of what to trust. Those instincts are just starting to grow in the US, at least in my estimation.
Yuliya, if I could invite you as well. You're representing Ukraine for an international election monitor, observer, study. How much, when you're interacting with your colleagues in other countries, how aware are they of what's happening here, and how aware are they that it can happen there too?
I believe they are much more aware of what is happening in Ukraine, since Ukraine is a strategic partner for many countries, and due to its geopolitical position and location, it plays a significant role in global policy. And we and other countries acknowledge this, and of course people want to study from Ukrainian experience, which is unique to some degree, as for example talking to social media issue. We are always discussing Facebook and Twitter. However, we do not pay much attention to Odnoklassniki and VKontakte, Russian social media networks. And despite the fact that they are officially banned in Ukraine, they are among 25 the most popular websites in Ukraine. Unfortunately, lots of Ukrainians are using VPN system in order to get information to this. And comparatively to Facebook and Twitter, which are responsible social media networks, and Facebook starting from 2016 introduced a strategy, remove, reduce, and inform. So they are removing fake accounts and fake information. They are reducing spreading of disinformation and spreading information by fake groups. And also they are informing their users on their standards, and also on disinformation. Odnoklassniki and VKontakte, they are not such responsible, believe me. And it's a great tool for Russian propaganda, and it's quite active here. And people who used to use this social media, unfortunately, they are still trying to get access to this social media, and lots of groups which are sharing this fake information, and it's quite difficult to track them, since nobody pays attention to this as much as to the Facebook and Twitter, since Facebook and Twitter are global networks, while Odnoklassniki and VKontakte are more regional networks, and of course they are out of attention of many global organizations. At the same time, I believe that they played much more influence to Ukrainian elections, and they spread much more disinformation comparatively to what was shared on Facebook and Twitter. Since now on Twitter you could see who paid for some advertising. Previously it was an option just for US and Canada, and finally for these elections it was also introduced for Ukraine. So now you could be much more cautious, and you could just see who paid for this information. But in case of Odnoklassniki, of Kontakte, you couldn't track such information. And lots of people who are pro-Russian by themselves, and then they are following pro-Russian propaganda network, and they are getting even more convinced that they are on the right road. And this is more dangerous, I would say, comparatively to what is happening on Facebook and Twitter in Ukrainian context.
At the risk of being the only naysayer on Facebook and Twitter for a second here, they certainly have put some transparency measures in place, and they've been working hard to take down some clearly fake accounts. We still haven't seen a change in the incentive structure of an advertising company, and that's what Facebook is, right? And they're enormous, and we don't have clarity around how the algorithms work that are incenting certain types of news to show up first in your feed, right? There's a lot of pieces to Facebook, and I think it's worth going specifically to Facebook because that is the dominant player in this field where people are getting news. And I don't think we've had a full grappling for a lot of reasons in the US on what the power of Facebook controlling most people's media landscape looks like and how that enables or changes the way that political dialogue occurs, right? So I know that's a whole nother panel and that's a completely different topic, but I think we're giving a lot of credit to small steps that have been taken since 2016, but the bigger question here is what does that media environment do for broader geopolitics, enabling cyber attacks, changing how people perceive information, and we haven't really done a lot there.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for the first part of the panel. I would now like to open the floor up to questions to our audience. So please, if anybody would like to pose any questions. Is there a microphone? Is there a question?
Oh, you go.
Yes, please.
Thanks. So in response to the cyber attack against Estonia in 2007, we did nothing. In response in 2014, we did nothing. We, meaning the international community. 2017, NotPetya didn't do much of anything. Let's say in a scenario, and I don't want to give the Kremlin ideas, but new President Zelensky is giving his inaugural speech, and there's a cyber attack against Ukrainian television, and no one hears it. What should the response to that kind of scenario or the next cyber attack be so that the Kremlin gets the message that you're not going to get away with this anymore?
Laura, would you like to address that?
The first call to duty, and it actually was the call in 2007, is to get a team to look at the artifacts and attribute it, right? International attribution is incredibly powerful. If there's 4 countries that come out and say, we've looked at this and we agree that this is the Russian military, that puts it right in the category of how do you respond to another attack by the Russian military, right? So clear attribution that is forcefully discussed and judged by multiple governments is critical. And you'll laugh because I think you're right in that the U.S. didn't do a whole lot about NotPetya, but the U.S. and the British government did come out 7 months later and attribute NotPetya to the Russian military. Now, Ukraine came out right away and was able to attribute this to the Russian military. So speed and who is willing to say this is an attack coming from whatever the state might be is critical as a first measure to have a joint response.
But what if in the attribution, the Kremlin has reached a point where it says, you're damn right it was us?
I think that response is just in line as if they sent a nuke over and said, of course it came from us, right? I mean, it's not on the parallel in terms of response, but in clarity of what action needs to take place, it depends on what the effect of that cyber attack was, and the Kremlin owning up to it would be a surprise, but all the more clarity in how a country would need to respond.
Kenneth, I could bring you in here. I think this is an interesting point in terms of attribution and how difficult that is. I think one of the the signatures of hybrid warfare is this one step away from the state, this idea, and Putin has said this on a number of occasions, like, it's volunteers in East Ukraine, it's not the Russian military, right. It's the Wagner boys or whatever. The same in the cyberspace. It's it's hackers. It's whatever. Is it the 400-pound guy in the basement or whatever it may be? It's not the state. I mean, how do we? How do you put the finger on and say, okay, we all know it's Russia. How do we prove it? How difficult is that technically?
So it's tough, but I think David actually brings up a terrific point in that even if they stand up and say, "Damn right, it's me," what are you going to do about it? It's like you're in a bar, all of a sudden, it's tough. So I've been working with NATO on this thing called the Tallinn Manual that looks at international law as it relates to cyber conflict or cyber warfare. And so the lawyers, very early on, we met with lawyers from NATO, and they said, well, this is going to be tough because all the laws of war are written presuming that someone's dead, right? There's no tanks. This was the issue in 2007, right, for NATO. No tanks cross the border, no troops cross the border. And yet, Estonia raised its hand and said, we're under attack and we need help, right? So then NATO has done quite a lot to try and to understand the issue. But that's different than knowing what to do about it, right? And so the point David brings up is super salient, right? Because computer network operations fly under what's called the use of force, it's hard to know how, in the laws of war, to do a proportional response to it, right, on defense. That's an open question. And so the United States has been pretty vocal in the past about saying, if we're angry enough about your cyber attack, we will bomb you, we'll kill you, right? And there's a few things that have happened, like hackers dying, out there in the Middle East in particular. It's funny, a lot of cyber attacks or computer network operations are not like traditional military attacks. They're more like a covert operation, right? In which there's, they're not in uniform, but yet they are U.S. military or Russian military, and they're out there wandering around doing some kind of operation. Those personnel are at very high risk, if for capture or kill. You might never hear about them. They'll never make it into the news, etc. And it's sort of in the gray zone. So this gray zone operations, which is like hybrid warfare, it does make a cyber attack very hard, very hard. And I can't even answer your question. That's what I'm saying. All that to say, that's a great question with no answer today.
I mean, what is the toolkit that we have here? So if we can say a military response to a cyber attack in terms of guns and bombs and traditional responses is unrealistic, it's not going to happen, then what does that leave? It means a counter cyber attack, or is it simply in the sphere of sanctions, economic sanctions, restrictions placed on Russia that will hit them in the pocket?
Right, exactly. So,
in addition, NATO, Ukraine is not a NATO member state.
Yeah.
Sure.
But it's a critically important country to NATO. So what obligations does NATO have when it happens in a place like Ukraine? You use the term gray zone, which is very applicable in the case of Ukraine. Ukraine is in this very unfortunate gray zone.
So it's almost, there'll be something probably in cyberspace that happens, and of course with deterrence you want it to be visible, right? When you test a nuclear bomb, that's part of the point. You want people to see it, right, and fear you. But with numerous things in the past, we've promised retaliation for Sony, for example. NotPetya needs a response. Where is it? There should be some kind of a response. And I don't think we've seen them yet.
Well, I might differ a bit. So after Sony, the Obama administration did come out and say, we have responded in North Korea. Now, back to your point of this is treated like covert ops, it was, but we don't know what happened. Now, you can take the administration's word or not, it's classified, right? In terms of the early consequences of the 2016 Russian interference, the actions that the Obama administration did 3 weeks before leaving office, including expelling, I don't remember how many diplomats anymore, 24? So,
Dozens.
at least handfuls. But expelling diplomats, closing the old Russian compound in Annapolis. I mean, there were numerous steps taken. Whether they were strong enough to the crime, whether they were proportionate, it's a whole other question. But I do think it's fair to say that we have been able, the US government has been able to take steps as a result of attribution and clarity around some of the legal categories that have been put in place because of efforts like the Tallinn Manual and NATO classification of what a computer network operation would entail. So I'm going to just take that little bit stronger piece that there have been actual steps taken.
I'm with Laura as well as on the transparent and joint investigations. I think they can be super powerful. And I can also tell you that so some things will happen and they're like cross-domain retaliation as well. So I can tell you because I was looking at all this malware detection for about 2.5 years in every country on the planet. The day that Croatia decided to join the group that would expel a Russian diplomat, malware detection was off the charts in Croatia, same day. There was a display of anger on somebody's part, and it happened via computer networks in response to Croatia's decision to expel a Russian diplomat.
Sorry, Linus, please.
I mean, just to comment on that, I mean, the point is that we don't have a common cyber security policy in the way that during the 20th century we developed these agreements around nuclear proliferation and arms control, right? We don't have, a cyber control policy with our adversaries, and this is an open field, I think, in many ways to be explored, right? Because we don't have rules of the road, and there's a lot of fear and concern about who has escalation dominance. It's not as clear when it comes to conventional military threats, right? Where your adversary has this many nuclear warheads and this many tanks and et cetera. You can kind of figure out who has escalation dominance. In the cyberspace, because it is so covert, we actually don't have a good sense of that. We're talking about Russia right now, about the Chinese, right? So I think getting us to a place where we can establish a global international rules of the road in this space is really the big puzzle of the 21st century. And we're not anywhere near that. And so I think we don't have an answer of what is an effective cyber deterrence policy. I don't know what the answer to that is yet. We haven't really gone to it in a serious way, I think, right? And so I think this is kind of the next step as we're thinking about this really becoming the phase or the next phase of warfare, writ large.
Just to add up what Alina has said, Russia is the only one country which hasn't signed the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. And moreover, for the last 3 years, it tries to adopt new UN strategy, a kind of code of conduct in cyber area. And it pays lots of money and spends lots of efforts in order to get this strategy approved. And it's quite dangerous. So when Russia will be leading on this issue, and since others do not pay much attention on establishing such global policies, Russia is taking lead on this and spending lots of money and efforts on this, and it might be successful at some stage.
Let me just give a little historical context on this because I was involved in the negotiations with Russia back in 2010 on information weapons. So the Russians have, and the Chinese have joined them in now almost a 20-year effort to classify cyber weapons in arms control format. And the US has opposed it, along with most other countries in the West. And this is, again, a much longer discussion. But to put it in short, the key problem has been defining what is a cyber weapon or an information weapon. And the Russians have always looked for a much more expansive definition that includes propaganda, other information means, as a way to classify this broader set of activity in the codes of conduct and in other arms control agreements. And the US, for example, has opposed that because the types of activities like propaganda and news and information impede directly on First Amendment rights, and we don't typically classify psychological warfare within our set of arms and conventional weaponry. So that's been the core of the sticking point on why we haven't gotten to the level of clarity that we have in other conventional military settings, right? And because of that massive debate, right, the discussion turned to a place where we could make more headway, which was around norms, right? When is it acceptable to use different techniques in cyberspace, right? And that's where I think we've been able to make the most headway. And this isn't to disagree with this being the next area of growth from a doctrinal and in a kind of normative standpoint for what countries need to do to add predictability there. But I do think that we've been trying to pave that path collectively for, over a decade, at least, from my own personal experience, but probably closer to 20 some years. So we do, in what that will look like in terms of deterrence, is incredibly hard to predict because we haven't been able to get basic agreements on definitions of what we're calling these different tools, right? So all that is just some context of, I think there have been a lot of efforts there and people have done quite a bit. And we do have some actual test cases now where stealing intellectual property via networks is off limits. Like that is an established norm that took 6 years to develop, but that I think is pretty clear to the Chinese and others. So we do have good examples where that has served us well.
Is it a case where we need a Geneva Convention of sorts for cyberspace, perhaps? I just wanted to raise the issue of this new this legislation that's going through Russia at the moment, the so-called RUNET, this cutting Russia off from the internet. If we regard cyberspace as a battlefield now, as perhaps perhaps the most important emerging battlefield of the 21st century, how's that going to change the game? What will that mean if Russia cuts itself off but remains engaged with the global cyberspace, but actually has it basically creates a fortress for itself while everybody else is out there in the open, so to speak?
So I think this is going to be very unpopular in Russia, right? And so they're playing with fire. You can put all of Wikipedia on a hard drive now, on a thumb drive, and carry it into North Korea, certainly into Russia. And you're foregoing the benefits. The whole point of connecting to the web, right, is to gain more than you lose, right, through trade and information. And I don't want to be naive on this. I don't want to be unwise and suggest that I don't know, somehow that this isn't going to be bad. Right? Because it will be bad. There's a lot of evil in the world. There's going to be a lot of evil in the world. And Putin is a bad guy. But I don't think that many Russians are going to be happy with cutting. They were very suspicious about the Cyrillic domain name system, right? From the get-go. The Russian government was like, hey, we're going to change to Cyrillic. And the people were like, that sounds really scary, right?
Yeah, just to actually add some numbers to what you're saying, Ken, I was looking at these statistics recently. The Levada Center did a poll. Putin signed this law into law on May 1st. It's supposed to come into effect in November. I've been looking at it. As far as I can tell, most technical experts don't think it's actually possible to implement it, and it's going to cost the Russian government a hell of a lot of money. So we shouldn't assume that they're technically capable of doing what this law suggests that they should do, mainly because the Russians have not built out the Chinese model in the same way the Chinese have pursued their own ability to actually build a bifurcated internet structure. And so from the Russian side, though, the Levada Center survey showed that the majority of Russians want the internet to grow and penetrate further in their country. They want to be global. They want to be connected. A minority of Russians thought, it was like 20-something%. It was pretty low. I liked the idea of having some sort of quote-unquote sovereign Russian internet. So there's not a lot of support for this. We saw some protests already when the parliament, the Duma, was doing its readings of the quote-unquote readings of the law. But I don't think these were mass spread enough to cause any governmental response. And I don't see that being the basis for some sort of protest movement, because it's a lot of the things that the government has been doing has actually been to try to kind of drive a wedge and repress just a little bit more the liberal middle class, which they see as a real threat to their own regime, right? So a lot of the previous policies have also done that. But I think technically there's no clarity that they'll actually be able to implement this thing. Russians have proven themselves to be quite innovative and entrepreneurial in how they get around these laws. One example is the Telegram fight that the Russian government lost. Right? They lost a fight with a relatively small messaging app because they couldn't shut it down. So how are they going to actually install an ability to have a kill switch for the Russian internet if they can't even deal with one app?
And it hasn't worked in China. I mean, the Great Firewall of China, right? As a concept for censorship, et cetera. I mean, yes, you have to do some work in China to get around that, but the proliferation of cybercrime in China and your ability to outstrip the censorship that goes on with the parallel network in China is so widely known that I think any sort of attempt to copy a similar technical means not only won't work, horse is already out of the barn on how the internet's structured, right? And then B, it just creates a backlash to how do I get to the forbidden information? So yeah.
Yeah. I believe that even if Russia would do this, it will just make the access to the internet more complicated and more expensive. However, it will not block totally the access. Even on the plane now, you could have an access to the internet. Yeah, they could close line access to the internet, but it's not possible to close all the technologies. That's why I believe that as in Ukraine, when Ukrainian authorities decided to block Russian social media and websites, Ukrainians found the way how to get access to this. So I believe that even if Russia will do this, there would be more or less similar scenarios. And I believe that internet is quite important for Russians as well. Nowadays, for any person, it's quite important to get information, to be engaged with others, and I believe that even Russians will find the way how to get access to the internet.
Once more, I'd like to invite any questions. If there's anyone, before we close the session, does anybody have any commentaries or questions to raise? No? Well, in that case, then I'd like to invite some final comments. Oh, sorry, excuse me.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Just wanted to invite final comments, if I may, from our panelists to come back to the issue at hand, as it were, the parliamentary elections. If I could ask you to speculate a little bit, what are the key things to watch out for, in your opinion, looking ahead in terms of cybersecurity over the next 5 months?
First of all, we need to remember that parliamentary campaign has already started. So it won't start in August. It's already ongoing. And everything what is happening, it is happening now. And now we should keep a close attention to what is happening with the Central Election Commission and its infrastructure. Also, we should pay attention, more attention to state voter register system. While CEC IT infrastructure wasn't damaged during this particular election, on the E-Day of the first round, we've seen that state voter register website failed for, I don't know, 1 or 2 hours. And it was not harmful since Ukraine doesn't use electronic voter list, and all voter lists were already printed at the polling station. Ukraine doesn't track the voters in electronic voting list. So it was not such harmful, but at the same time it showed that this website is vulnerable for external influence, and the CEC should pay much greater attention to secure this website, since it could create an impression that its infrastructure is not secured. And as I said earlier, such impression could be even more harmful comparatively to what is happening in practice. Also, cyber hygiene for all stakeholders who are involved in elections should be must-have, and it's not only about the Central Election Commission. We should remember what happened with Zelensky website. Once they launched its website, it also faced with lots of attacks, and actually such DDoS attack blocked the access of real users for certain period of time. And I believe that political parties should protect and pay greater attention to their websites as well, since cybersecurity, it's not only about state authorities, it's also about political parties, NGOs like Opora, Committee of Voters of Ukraine. I believe their websites also could face with cyber attacks. So in this regard, I believe that Ukraine has a lot of things to do.
That was very comprehensive. The only thing I'll add is I think there is a lesson from Germany's elections in that targeting some of the far-right parties, Russia was able to make a decent amount of noise, I think it was around the AfD in the past election, whereas they didn't go and target the actual broader national election. So I think your point is spot on about how do the parties make sure that they're not compromised, but then thinking about this more broadly, are there some pivotal parts of the country in elections that if the party that looked to be winning could be undermined quickly with information leaks or other compromises, I think that would be an interesting vector for the Russians to play in.
I think my colleagues summarized it quite well, so I will just let those comments sit.
So I think, again, we have another chance in the United States to learn from Ukraine. So since you're having your election this year and the Rada coming up soon, I hope that the Ukrainians will come help the Americans to secure their election across the Atlantic.
Okay, well, on that message, we will end. Thank you very much. So thank you to all our panelists for a very informative discussion, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Peter. Let me just say in closing that putting this event together has taken a lot of time and effort. So first, a huge thanks to Leona for all the great work, not just for today, but throughout the entire project. Shelby, thank you for being here as well. Michael Newton and Geisha Gonzalez back in Washington were also key players in this, and John, thanks to you. As you saw throughout the day, I had the fortune of working with some amazing colleagues in putting this task force project together, and the work is on the ukraineelects.org website. So I hope you'll visit that to see the months of work that has gone into this final report. Our thanks to our partners, Victor Pinchuk Foundation, Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, to our other contributors, Detective Media, and StopFake.org, and of course Razumkov Center. And thanks to all of you for staying throughout the day. I have to say, as someone with some bad jet lag, I actually stayed awake the entire day, which is a reflection of terrific panel discussions. So my thanks to this panel and the previous panels as well. Final thought I'll leave you with is that some people may criticize us for hyping up the interference from outside in Ukraine's election. I will gladly take that criticism than to stand up here and say, boy, I wish we had been better prepared for what had come. So it's much better to be prepared and to look back and say, wasn't as bad as we feared, than to look back and say, boy, we blew it. We weren't prepared for that one. So we will try to see about taking that same spirit, whether this project continues or not for the Rada elections. It is up to Ukrainians first and foremost to be prepared again, to constantly remain vigilant. But I think one way or another, you can certainly count on the international community to be there in support. So thank you very much for coming, and wish you the best.
Yeah, you were great.